Get ready for Rivalry Week in the UFA. This Saturday night, watch the New York Empire and DC Breeze meet for the first time this season as they collide in our nation's capital at 7 p.m. Eastern. And that leads right into a premier West Division battle as the undefeated Salt Lake Shred put their perfect record on the line against the Colorado Summit. Don't miss this thrilling doubleheader. Empire Breeze at 7, Summit Shred at 9, exclusively on WatchUFA.tv.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. I'm Adam Ruffner. That is Cameron Brock. We apologize for the slight delay in the recording of this episode. I've been sick with the virus the past couple of days. Cameron's been traveling, but we are back with you to both recap the insanity of a 14-game Week 6 slate, as well as set up the upcoming Rivalry Weekend in Week 7. There is DC and New York. There is Salt Lake, Colorado. Austin goes to travel to face Atlanta and Carolina. It is a big boy weekend upcoming as we head into June in the UFA. But man, I would be remiss if we didn't spend some time talking about the results of Week 6. I think at the top headline has to be Boston's 2-0 weekend. I'll go ahead and say it. The most impressive 2 wins in a given weekend during the regular season I've seen in this league's history. Boston goes on the road last Friday night, wins at New York, 16-14 against the Empire, snaps a home winning streak that dated back to June 2018 for the Empire. You want to talk about some big revenge for last year's MVP Jeff Babbitt coming back and facing his former team for the second time this season? I can't think of a much more satisfying result. And just for note, in 2 games against New York this season, Jeff Babbitt has a combined 2 assists, 8 goals, 2 blocks, is 52 of 52 from the field, 599 total yards, 0 turnovers. When it comes to value, you know, in that V in the MVP, I don't know that you can show that much more succinctly than when Babbitt has done against New York. That would have been impressive enough for the Glory. But then on Sunday, they host 4-1 DC, who is coming off of 3 straight wins, and Glory get a 16-15 victory, swatting away a potential game-tying goal at the end of regulation. They now sit at 5-2 after their very impressive Week 6 slate. Elsewhere in the league, Atlanta finishing off Colorado 18-16 in last week's Super Series matchup. Hustle had just 12 team turnovers. Brett Halsmeyer just continues to be a level above any defender or set of defenders that really come in his vicinity. And I would be remiss if I didn't comment on this, because I've had Hustle members come up to me after making a comment last week that he was a fridge. Tuba Bench and Jaja in the postgame interview referred to Brett being a fridge, that he was full of a lot of things. I'm misquoting him here. He had a great quote about it. I made the remark about Halsmeyer being like a fridge last week for one very specific reason. It takes 2 people to move that guy, if not more. And Colorado tried to use 2 defenders on him numerous times. Did not work at all. The big guy finishes with 7 total scores, 42 of 43 from the field, 582 total yards, an MVP level performance for an all UFA member. Carolina goes 2-0 through their Texas road trip. They now sit at 4-0. They are one of 2 teams, along with Salt Lake, still undefeated at this point in the season. Carolina has won their 4 games by a combined 5+ goals per. So that kind of gives you a sense of how much higher the Flyers are than their competition so far in 2024. And Anders Jungst, through 4 starts this season, 6.5 scores per game, 30 completions at a 90% clip, and 433 total yards. Really impressive numbers there from the Carolina captain. Also of note, Seattle, 5-2 after their 2-0 SoCal road trip. They now sit in 2nd place in the West Division, just 2 games back of Salt Lake, surprisingly. And in their last 3 games, all wins, Cascades are averaging just 15 turnovers per game, a marked shift for the Seattle franchise that has historically struggled with mistakes. And though they've played more games than the majority of teams this season, it bears mentioning that the Cascades currently roster the league leader in goals scored in Zeppelin Ronig, the league leader in hucks completed in Christian Foster, and the league leader in blocks in Lucas Ambrose, who, by the way, led last year in blocks. Uh, in the Central Division, total chaos. And Cam, this is where I'm going to bring you in because I mentioned this on my broadcast on Sunday night for the Madison Radicals. It is a total rock, paper, scissors affair. And honestly, we need a fourth implement of some kind to really give the scope of what's happening in the Central Division because on Friday night, Chicago beats Madison by a goal. Chicago then goes to face you guys in Indianapolis on Saturday night. Alley Cats win on a heroic buzzer beater from you, 21-20 in the waiting moments of regulation. Then y'all, Indy, go on the road Sunday to face a Pittsburgh down Max Shepard and Carl Johnson, arguably two of their three best players. And you guys get kind of Donnybrooke'd on the road. And now, after all the dust is settled, Minnesota still sits at the top of this division, Chicago just behind them. But Madison, Pittsburgh, Indy, y'all are in a melee. What was it like for you to pull down that buzzer beater Saturday night and then turn around and have the kind of performance the Alley Cats did on Sunday?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a complete opposite end of the spectrum, right? Like we're hosting a Chicago team that is pretty hot at that time. You know, they've just come off two wins in Texas and the night before beating Madison. So, and we played not flawlessly on offense, but we played a pretty dang good offensive game. And we felt really good about adjustments we've made as we've learned our new offense. And of course, coming off with a buzzer beater, um, it's fun, it's exciting. But, you know, like you said, we go to Pittsburgh, and hats off to Pittsburgh. I mean, they completely from the very beginning, they hopped on us early. They were in the driver's seat from the first point of the game, and they didn't let off the gas. They played a style of ultimate I feel like I've never seen from Pittsburgh in the entire existence of their franchise, which was patience. Not a lot of hucking, not a lot of deep shots. I think they only attempted 4 on the day. This is a team that, since their inception, has kind of lived and died by the deep shot.
I've got a stat there
And
for you. They haven't attempted
yeah,
under 11 this season, other than on
yep.
Sunday against the Alley Cats.
Well, and I think you take away Max Shepard, a guy who is, probably their best deep thrower, Carl Johnson, who is their best deep option as a receiver, and they, instead of trying to play the same style without the pieces that they play that style with, they adapted and adjusted, and they played an incredibly clean game. Like, hats off to them. They outplayed us in every way that they possibly could, and so here we are, 2-2, just trying to figure out where we belong.
Yeah, and Pittsburgh 3-3 after they now set a regular season record for fewest turnovers in a four-quarter game, committing just 5. And like you say, one of the more impressive team performances truly I've seen in this league's history. They were 22 of 22 inside the red zone, another big meta stat that I know a lot of coaches are putting a lot of importance on, both in terms of volume of looks and obviously in terms of efficiency. 22 scores within the 20 yards of the end zone is really impressive stuff from the Thunderbirds. They were 81% on offensive success rate and 82% on defensive success rate against you guys. So again, just a real almost season-saving performance, I'll say it, for the Thunderbirds at home. But doubling back to the top of week 6 items mentioned, I wanted to get to Boston because they're really starting to look like the team we thought as being the highest potential heading into the season. We weren't sure if they would ever reach it. We weren't sure sort of when it would happen. Well, we're now 6 weeks into the season, and this team is coming off of 2 games in which they committed just 19 combined turnovers against DC and New York defenses, 2 of the top 6 in the league, 8 defensive units. They're not making mistakes, the glory. They're really holding opposing offenses in check. I've been really impressed with Boston's defensive ability to take away explosives and kind of make other teams grind it out against them. I mean, New York and DC scored a combined 29 goals against them. And there's just, if you just kind of start going through all the team stats for this glory squad, there is not much breathing room to get against them. They were 60% on their offensive drives throughout the weekend. They were 9 of 12 on defensive opportunities combined in both games, 75%. And they just, for lack of a better way to say it, have that look. They look like a championship level team. They knocked off the reigning champs. They knocked off the perennial number 2 in this division the past several seasons, who figures to also be a championship level team if they didn't have the ceiling above them that has been the New York Empire for the past half decade. What were your impressions of Boston this last weekend?
I think you kind of really put it well at the beginning of the pod where you said this might be the most impressive weekend in the regular season that any team's ever had. Because when you think about, across the league, most divisions don't usually have 3 teams that we consider to be at as high a level as New York, Boston, and DC all are. And, we talked last week about, or in the preview, what are what are the playoff pictures going to look like after this weekend? And while in some respects you might look at it as 3 teams all sitting with the same record, essentially all sitting with 2 losses at the top of that division, schedule-wise, Boston just put themselves in first place. They don't have any out of division games. They're sitting with the rest of their schedule being games against Montreal, Toronto, and Philly.
Teams with a combined 3 wins so far this season. They each have
exactly.
1.
It would be incredibly surprising to me if they dropped any of those games. Meanwhile, New York and DC have to play each other twice. New York's also got out of division games against Minnesota and Salt Lake. The odds of those 2 teams also running the table are not very likely. So, Boston reminds me a lot of, to use a football comparison, like the Broncos that won Super Bowl 50 with Peyton Manning on one leg, where offensively they don't really wow you. They're certainly capable and they're going to put up enough goals, but it's really that defense that's just so overwhelming for other teams. They just seem to be like the blanket that can put out the fire of any other team's offense. I mean, we're talking about a DC team that in 2 games against them has barely gotten to 20 goals combined, 25 goals maybe combined in those 2 games against DC. That's pretty dang impressive. And there's been such a complete transformation of the confidence that they play with too. Like last year, they couldn't compete with the big boys. And, you add some players like Ben Katz and Jeff Babbitt who have these years of winning championships and, winning 30 games in a row. And they know what it takes to go out there and win and what you have to do to compete with these teams. And it's just, there's been a complete culture shift. And it's been really impressive, especially with those guys signing so late, that they've been able to pull this off.
I also think, and this is a credit to the players and the coaching staff, they do a better job than just about every team at balancing the roles of their veterans and their performative impact versus unleashing their sort of stable of younger stars or up and coming players. You talk about the Babbitts, the Brendan McCann, team captain on defense, who's having a career year this year. Don't just go look at the numbers. Trust in what I'm saying and go watch a little bit of how he leads this team on the field. I mean, he got a gigantic hand block in the 4th quarter of the game at New York to essentially close it out for them. And as he was going to the sideline, you can read his lips on the broadcast. I'll try to bleep one of the words, but he said, "We are winning this effing game right here." And you talked a moment ago about that confidence. He's been a big booster of that. Tanner Johnson-Go coming back to this team has been terrific. He just seems to make the play when they need him to. He's not somebody who needs to fill up on volume, but if you need if you need a thrower to come back into the handler set and do a little bit of leg work and motion for you, he pretty much slots in wherever they need him to on offense. And then, as far as other sort of standout vets that I'm looking at in this lineup, you talk about Ben Sadok. I mean, he's been terrific for them in now his 4th season, excuse me, and just continues to minimize his turnovers. And he's really just kind of shifted his strengths into the most opportune sort of position on the field, which is the red zone. He is so squirrely in tight spaces. And that front cone little whirly bird cut that he used against Jasper Tom on Sunday to get a layout goal. He has been doing that to defenders all season to an optimal degree. Like, he just continues to get open, get the squeaky wheel cut that just finds its needle way through the defense and gets them a tough score when they figure to need it most. I've just been so impressed with the veteran leadership on this team. And then you just see how it kind of cascades down to all of their young players seemingly contributing at some point during these big games. I mean, Simon Carapella has completely evolved as a player now in his second year. Turner Allen, you talk about the defensive upturn this year. He's been fantastic for them as a versatile big. I kind of thought of him as being a little bit more athlete who you put on people in space and try to hope that they throw up jump balls and let him go attack. But he's been on handlers in the backfield. He's been using his length to just frustrate throwers. I think he's been a terrific part of that defense. Peter Borth continues to play on both sides of the disc and make an impact. I just think that there's so much to like as far as like how Boston develops their roles.
Well, and let's look at something. I mean, it's hard to measure in a game like Frisbee, like how much impact one player can have sometimes. But like they had Orion Cable both games this weekend, and that is a big
Thank you.
dude. Like that is not a guy. Like they have. This is only what I believe he's only played 3 games now, but that he wasn't in the first DC game. He wasn't in the first New York game, and you know, it's one of those things where you can put him on either side of the disc. He played a little bit more defense in the New York game and a lot more offense in the DC game. He's good wherever you put him. Like, it's never bad to have a guy that big and that skilled. I mean, he's not just some big goon running around there. I mean, the dude's a world's player for a reason. When he's there, it's like they already have enough to compete, and then you put him out there, and it's just like that's the thing that like really puts them over the edge, I think, is like having just that one more big athletic guy that can kind of go anywhere you need him to on the field and help out, right? Like they seem to have a little bit of an answer for everything, and like watching them feels a lot like watching like 80s and 90s football. They're the team that runs the ball 40 times a game.
Great
That's the way it
ground
feels
game.
like, kind of.
Great ground game.
Yeah. They run the damn ball. That's what they do. And their offense isn't flashy. It's oftentimes can almost lull you to sleep a little bit because it's just kind of like a lot of not very exciting things going on. But then, like you said, they get in the red zone and somebody makes Ben Sadok's making a little squirrely cut. Simon Carapella is finding himself open in tight spaces and really developed his throwing game this year, where it seems like he's a lot more comfortable getting that disc outside of the end zone and continuing it upfield, and it's working for them. And like, I mean, they're the front runners in that division right now. Like, it's really the other teams are going to have to hope that they trip up against one of the bottom teams in their division if they want to have a chance at hosting the playoffs. Otherwise, we're going to be seeing the East running through Boston this year, and that looks pretty likely.
Another name I wanted to shout out for Boston that's been playing extremely well, another captain alongside Brendan McCann, Nathaniel Dick. He leads the team in completions.
Oh, yeah.
He's got up over a 97% completion rating and is just a perfect cleaner fish for this offense. He never feels like he's out of turn in the decision making that he goes through and making his reads as a thrower. It's just where the disc needs to go flows out of his hand. And I've just been so impressed with him. He's now in his 3rd season with the team. Before this year, he never managed more than 75 completions in 8 starts last year for Boston. This year in 7, he's got 342, again at above a 90% clip, and is just a really good backfield complement to Sadok. They've got a little bit of a metronome quality in that they can kind of build up a rhythm with short passes between each other and then kind of start getting their legs going and mobilize everything. Again, to your point, this isn't a totally sexy offense. They don't just look to strike at you and use their speed and strength. But they do know how to find their spots, find their rhythm, and work through those positions.
Yeah, sometimes they hold the disc a little bit, makes you a little nervous, and sometimes it kind of looks like they don't know where the next pass is going, but they oftentimes are able to move the disc somewhere and then eventually something opens up. Their offense is a lot of like swing, swing, swing. Okay, now we finally got hit it upfield. Okay, now we're gonna swing, swing, swing it again. All right, there's a shot upfield. Like it's not like you said, it's not the Salt Lake offense where it's pretty much just forward momentum the whole way down the field and catch me if you can. It's very methodical. It's very safe in a lot of ways. Like they're not taking a lot of risky throws. I think the riskiest throw I saw all weekend uh, was actually an Orion Cable very very hopeful huck that he threw about 15 yards too deep. Um, but outside of that, I mean, it's just working the disc back and forth until something opens up, and they seem to be very comfortable with that. Like it's not always the most exciting, and it doesn't always look like very comfortable from our vantage point sitting on a couch, but they they seem to be comfortable with it. Like we have enough of a sample size on them now to see that it works and to see that they can make this work. And they're totally fine having their games, be in the mid to upper teens. Like they don't need to put up 22, 23 goals a game because their defense is so smothering that they can just kind of burn the clock on offense and score when they score. And they know that defensively they're going to be holding teams down. This is going to be where you have your season low in goals when you go and play Boston.
They currently commit the fewest turnovers per game in the league at under 13. They're at 12.2 through 7 games in 2024. And they have 3 games already with under double-digit turnovers, including at New York on Friday, which is, again, a real put an asterisk by that performance. And let's go back to it when we're kind of getting into playoff previews and stuff, because I can't really tell you how many times an opponent has gone to New York and finished with sub 10 turnovers, right? And kind of getting back to your point about Orion Cale being in their lineup, the confidence, there is a show of force that this Boston team now has when they have their full strength lineup with Babbitt, Cable, etc., that they can just kind of line up their 7 against you and say, yeah, we're good with this. We'll just go ahead with this point. And seeing them do that against New York was pretty damn eye-opening, I think. Like their ability to just take teams at their top lineup versus the Glories is really impressive to me. Like that to me is one of the greatest signs of them being a possible championship contender. I mean, I don't even think we really need to say possible anymore after this past weekend.
No. They are clearly a championship contender. I would actually love to see
I
like a
just
Salt Lake Boston matchup. Like, can
I
you
just think
imagine
you
like that high
always
powered offense versus this defense?
I just think you have to put a little bit of brakes on it because this is still a franchise looking for its first playoff win. Now, there's been expansion teams that have come into this league and won championships a couple of times, so I don't want to say it's out of the realm of possibility. The West Division teams that are now kind of the perennial front runners in Colorado and Salt Lake have had postseason successes kind of at the newish end of their tenures. Like it can happen, and clearly with a roster constructed around Babbitt, it can happen for the Glory too. I just want to apply a little bit of padding around championship contender Boston at the beginning part of June.
Yeah, we can put some padding on it, but they also have, a couple of 3-time champions on their roster now. So, it's a lot of times when we see these teams that have to kind of like take their lumps, like even like New York Empire, right? In 2018, they had to take their lumps before they went and won it in 2019. I am not sure Boston needs to do that when you add a couple players like Ben Katz and Jeff Babbitt who have been there, done that, and one of them being, the reigning MVP. I'm not saying they're going to win the championship, but like I think it's not out of the realm of possibility. I mean, they've just gone and had this impressive 2-game weekend where they beat 2 teams who I think we could say could be in that conversation for competing. So they basically, in some ways, they kind of almost had a mini championship weekend experience right here
Okay.
in front of our eyes. Come on.
I'm gonna push back on that. I think that there is a vastly different set of circumstances between playoffs and regular season matchups. I mean, you know this better than almost anybody. There's just a gruel and a churn to this point in the season that I think makes any sort of game a little bit of tea leaf reading as far as what it tells us. Now, I'm not trying to take anything away from Boston. I'm just trying to say that I don't know how far we can apply in the future these two wins. I think that they're absolutely franchise defining for the Glory thus far, but it doesn't print you a ticket to championship weekend.
You heard it here first, Boston. Adam Ruffner, glory doubter.
Yeah, that's definitely what I've been so far. I think I rolled them out in the top 6 in my preseason power rankings. I've definitely been super low on this team coming into 2024. But I wanted to touch on a couple other things on week 6 before we get into our week 7 preview portion. And we're going to kind of build into week 7 as we talk about this stuff because I wanted to talk about the two South Division teams that are sitting at the top, Atlanta and Carolina. Atlanta getting their win at Colorado, and Carolina getting 2 wins at Austin last Friday night and then at Dallas. Both of these teams looking like the top end of the division, and then they're set to host Austin in week 7. Now, Austin has lost their last 2 games against potential playoff competition at home, both Chicago and Carolina coming into Austin and defeating them. They got a win on Saturday this past weekend at Houston and sit at 3-2 in the standings. But given how the Soul have struggled against the Hustle and the Flyers historically in the regular season, and just given how they look right now, they look out of sorts. They look like a team, funnily enough, lacking an identity despite returning like 95% of their roster that won the division last year. They just don't look like they know what they want to do. What do you think about the Soul heading into these two South Division matchups, given where they're coming from this past weekend, given what they're heading into? Where I think is that we might see one of those weekends where we're suddenly reminded as to the top end talent of the Soul and what their possibility is. I don't know if it happens in both games, but I think in one of these games we might get one of those supercharged Soul performances.
They better hope that we do. Otherwise, they're going to get their butts kicked this weekend in two different cities, which that would really suck. Because look, the Soul are a mess right now, and it honestly for me, it's not a talent issue. It is a complete meltdown in strategy. I posted a clip of this actually Friday night on Twitter. So if anyone cares to see the clip, I'm going to be referencing. I mean, their defensive strategy seems to be like very confusing to me in a lot of situations. We saw on Friday night they actually were up one after starting off the game pretty rough against Carolina. They managed to get a 1-goal lead at the end of the second quarter. Carolina calls a timeout, and they're within about 20 yards of the end zone. They double the thrower and leave Alan Laviolette wide open in the middle of the field, basically so he can pick to throw it to wherever he wants to with no mark on him. Like, this is like the most inane. My brain almost exploded at the lack of thinking about why this was such a terrible idea. And of course, what's he do? He puts an absolute dime ball right onto Terrence Mitchell. Unfortunately, Terrence Mitchell drops it. So Austin does maintain their lead, but it's like things like that where like the strategy makes zero sense, and they're just like leaving so many gaps and holes defensively. And then on offense, they just look completely out of sorts. People aren't in good places to like reset the disc. So we see handlers being stranded without any easy options when there's nothing available upfield. The only teams that they've been able to look good against have been the bottom teams in their division in Houston and Dallas. And when they've played against Chicago, when they played against Carolina, things have just been like falling apart. I'm not sure why that is. This seemed like the year where they were going to jump forward. This seemed like the year where they were going to kind of ascend to be at the top of that division without us questioning, can Austin do this? Can they compete with Atlanta? Can they compete with Carolina? And now I'm right back there. Like before this season and even after their first couple of performances, I was like, yes, this is the year. Austin is making the leap. They're going to be like, this is going to be a melee at the top. And now I'm right back to where we've been, like a lot of people have been about them in every other season, where it's just like, nope, this is the team that's going to beat up on the worst teams in the division, and they are going to look like they are just objectively a tier or two below some of the other teams in their division. And until they can go out and like prove that I shouldn't think that way, that's going to be the way I perceive them moving forward. So this weekend could do a lot, I think, not just to shape my perspective. I'm sure there are other people who kind of have felt the same way that have been following this Soul team.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of break it down really simply along the Daniel Cohen axis of logic, which just looks at team turnovers per game. He's not wrong, by the way. It's a terrific, just sort of paradigm to ascribe to. You look at the Hustle, they're second overall in fewest turnovers per game. Flyers aren't that much further behind them, still within the top 7 in the league, and they're committing just over 15 per game. The Hustle are at 13 per game. The Soul, meanwhile, are over 19 per game and are in the bottom 9 of the league. The only teams below them are Pittsburgh, Oakland, LA, Nitro, Royale, Havoc, Dallas, Detroit. So it just kind of gives you a scope of where Atlanta and Carolina are versus Austin heading into these week 7 set of games. And just to your point about how Austin looks schematically, Atlanta and Carolina sure aren't having those problems. Like, those are two of the best teams in terms of in-game adjustments, having good prep, identifying matchups. I mean, that's what we just saw from the Hustle handling Colorado, who I would love to save some time talking about the matchup that they have going into at Oakland and at Salt Lake in week 7, and how they're still just sitting at 3 total games and we don't know a whole bunch about the Summit. But they looked like a slightly better version of themselves against Atlanta, and still they could just find no real purchase in overcoming the Hustle's basically 4-quarter lead in that game. And then we've talked about a bunch. Carolina looks like one of the 2 best teams in the league, if not the best team. They have, again, over a 5-goal margin of victory against every opponent. They have 2 wins already against the aforementioned Hustle team. Like, these are 2 cold-blooded killer kind of squads that the Hustle, or excuse me, Austin has to figure out how to get back on track against.
Yeah, and to your point about Atlanta, we talked last week about Brett Holzmeier. Is he like the guy in the air? Hell yeah, he is.
Yeah,
Hell yeah, he is. Man, Colorado had nothing for him. I mean, Matthew Agee, who is not a small man, by the way, looked very small next to Brett Holzmeier.
helpless.
And you were right. Like,
helpless.
they were all helpless. And that's the thing with Brett. He's already got the height, right? But he is as good, if not the best in the league, in just getting position. And when a guy that's that big doesn't just rely on his height, but also is going to outposition you, you just have no chance. Like there is absolutely nothing you can do. I got to experience a little bit of this with John Lithio on Saturday, where it's just like, who is a large man himself, and it's just like when someone is that big and positions that well, I mean, you're just kind of at their mercy, and you just kind of have to hope that it doinks off their hands at that point. But Brett has been, I mean, he showed multiple times in Colorado that you're going to have to do more than throw 1 or 2 people at him. You really got to beat him to a spot, and you got to push him out, because you're not going to win if you're both just competing for the disc in the air. I mean, he is the biggest boy.
Well, and I kind of want to dovetail off of that and talk about both Holzmeier and Jungst, because I think they present specific star level problems that the Soul team hasn't really had answers for. Like, I think also in juxtaposition, Austin has its set of playmakers, and it's not to say that Kyle Henke or Mark Evans or Evan Swiatek, well, Mark Evans maybe a little bit, given he has 17 turnovers in 5, or 17 throwaways in 5 games. But these guys aren't necessarily having down seasons, but I am having trouble knowing when a Soul player is going to step up on any given point and kind of take it home for them. Whereas, again, with Holzmeier and Jungs, to say nothing of their supporting casts, Atlanta and Carolina have those dudes who they can just go out and get scores with.
Yeah, so it's like one of those really interesting things. Sometimes it shows up in the stats, sometimes not as much. John Lithia is a great example for this. Like the MVP of that game for Chicago, if you ask me, is Lithia. He doesn't have all the assists and goals, but like the dude is just always available and always making the right throw, right? And then when you look at guys like Youngston and Holzmeyer, they do it in very different ways. Obviously, they have very different physiques. Um, Jung's just always being available, you know, beating you under, beating you deep, making the continuation throws, something they're both able to do so well, but they just do it in such a different way. And you're right, when I watch Austin play, I can't tell where the gravity is because that's really what it ends up happening, right? Like when you go into a game with Atlanta, you have to worry specifically about what you're going to do about Brett Holzmeyer. When you go into a game against Carolina, you have to worry about like what Jungs is going to do. When you go up against Austin right now, I mean, who are you worrying about? They have good players, like maybe even some great players, but no one seems to be forcing the issue and forcing other teams right now to pay attention to them. When they've played against, their two games they've played against better competition, it kind of feels like an entire team letdown almost. Like no one's stepping up and being the person who's taking charge. No one is stepping up and forcing their teammates to be better. It just kind of looks like a team-wide letdown.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit concerned about that also, not because just that they have a lack of people stepping up, but also because we haven't talked uh, about this much, but Atlanta and Carolina's defenses this year look to be dog-filled units. I mean, the Hustle went out there and big boyed a very athletic Summit team this past weekend. Michael Fairley, I mean, Tuba Benson Jaja mentioned something about it earlier this season, but he is on an optimal level right now. I mean, he is just flying around out there as a big man. You add that to a unit that already has a potential Defensive Player of the Year candidate in Justin Burnett, as well as just depth, size, and speed available at pretty much any position you would want. I mean, the Hustle defense is something to behold right now. And then Carolina, despite not always being at the top of takeaways or necessarily defensive pressure, they know how to get to opposing offenses as well as any defensive unit in this league. And you could just see that last Friday night against Austin. You could see it in their two previous matchups against Atlanta. The Flyers are so good at matchup identification and who they want to put on you that it just becomes flustering to have to deal with that for 4 quarters when they have, again, the kind of lineup depth and rotational strength that Carolina does.
And Carolina is converting breaks at an insanely high
Yes.
percentage. Their red zone efficiency is, top 3 in the league right now. They do everything well. The one thing they don't do at, like as you mentioned, at like the upper echelon level is get blocks. But what they do is make offense hard for you, right? It's like almost like a more of a battle of attrition where you can score on Carolina, but there's not very often that you're going to score quickly. They have so many tall athletic defenders that you're not going to win the 50-50 balls, so any huck you throw has to be out into space. They don't give up a ton of those opportunities. So it's just one of those things where they kind of wear on you over the course of the game until you just start making mistakes. Now, relying on mistakes can be a dangerous game because not every team is going to break down and start making those mistakes, but they're about as good at making that happen as any team.
Yeah, and I think you could see more of the faults of that kind of strategy play out in Carolina last year. I feel like they've really learned off of maybe settling a bit too much in their coverage schemes and still now implementing a little bit more attack, a little bit more offside pressure, having a little bit more of a blitzing kind of defender out there who's going to take charge a little bit more in terms of, I'm going to be trying to get us layout blocks, whether that is the rookie Christian Bellis or Cooper Williams or somebody else. It just feels like there's a little bit more fuel or gasoline here for the Flyers D line this year. So now I wanted to make a sloppy transition away from talking about the South Division. We kind of wrapped together a little bit of Week 6 recap as well as setting up the Week 7 matchups of Austin at Atlanta on Friday night and then Austin at Carolina on Saturday night. But I wanted to push us further into the full Week 7 preview slate. We've got a lot to talk about heading into Rivalry Weekend, and most notably in the East Division, the battle of the two historical titans out there, New York at DC. Both of these teams coming into this game 4-2, not quite the records we're used to seeing from the Empire and the Breeze as they get set for their first matchup of the season. But this particular tilt figures to have a little something extra. I think most notably because New York is looking so, I don't want to quite say vulnerable, but let's say vulnerable in the East Division, as well as because DC has 2 losses, but those 2 have come to Boston and Salt Lake, 2 of the top 3 teams so far in the 2024 calendar. So I feel like the Breeze have a lot of motivation, and more than that, the kind of roster strength to really take advantage of this home hosting matchup against the visiting Empire. And I say that specifically because they have notably activated a World's Game roster member in Troy Holland, one of the true kind of X factor starting defensive pieces the past few seasons for the Breeze. He will be making his 2024 debut on Saturday night. And on the flip side for the Empire, they're going to be down a host of starters. Most notably, I feel like on defense, they'll be down Brett and Tan, both Dross brothers. And they'll also be down on offense, Elliot Chartok. And so because of those absences, they have elected to sign Kenneth Taylor III, who listeners might recognize as a member of the Atlanta Hustle the past couple of seasons. He did not roster with the team this year. New York is signing him due to their expected absences heading into Week 7. You and I were talking about it a little bit in the pregame. I don't know exactly where to factor in Taylor. He can be such a game changer in particular roles, but given the caliber of this Breeze as an opponent, and given New York's sort of struggles in establishing lineup continuity, I'm a little bit reluctant to say that this is going to be a solution piece going up against a foe like DC.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what he brings to the table. He's incredibly athletic guy. He's a guy who can be really lethal on a turnover. I would imagine he'll be out there playing, person defense, and they're hoping that he can generate some pressure. He definitely has the capability to do that, and we saw it actually with Atlanta last year in the games he played in. I mean, he got he forced D's, and then on the turn he was an option, right? He's a guy who can maybe bring a little punch to the counterattack and maybe generate a D in this game. And I think that's probably what they're looking for out of him. I mean, coming in middle of the season, never, I'm assuming 0 practices with the team and just kind of showing up. Yeah, that's pretty much all you can ask of someone in that situation. But yeah, I mean, they have so many absences going on the road to DC. I mean, DC's looked really solid all year. Like you mentioned, their 2 losses are at Boston and at Salt Lake. Those are 2 losses you don't get too upset about. Like you'd love to win those games, but that's 2 of the top teams in the league right there.
Yeah, and
I'm really nervous for New York in this game with all those absences.
yeah, and I also forgot to mention there was another notable New York signing in 2024 debut, but it's actually technically a re-signing. Tristan Yarder from Pittsburgh and Sabanur, also formerly played for Pittsburgh and New York in his rookie season as a teenager in 2019 and won a title with the then undefeated Empire. He'll be making his 2024 debut as well. It's been a couple of years since he's been at the pro level. And like Kenny Taylor, it just is a big question mark as to where he'll fill in. Both are fantastically talented players with a lot of upside potential. But again, going up against the Breeze, I don't know that there's necessarily a need fit solution here that's going to propel the Empire to a higher plateau. Like, what's been so impressive for me over their last set of games after they looked so unlike themselves in their first two matchups of the 2024 regular season is that New York kind of got back to basics. They figured out their offensive rotation, they figured out their handler backfield, they figured out how they wanted to play teams defensively in a way that wasn't just sort of relying on one-on-one matchups and the austerity of the New York D line. It really felt like they had a renewed focus. And now with these lineup injections, it feels a little bit more like how we saw New York enter the year, where it was, oh well, we can replace Ryan Osgar. We've got Liam Haberfield. We've got the best value version. Oh, like Jeff Babbitt. Like, we'll kind of moneyball it. We'll build in the aggregate, right? And that didn't work out so well, right? Like, they couldn't just keep being the impervious empire for forever. They had to kind of figure out a new way to roll into the 2024 season. And it felt like they were doing that. And even against Boston last weekend, you started to see in the third quarter, Ben Yacht started to take over a little bit. Their defense was getting crucial blocks late in the second half. Like, it felt like an empire team. And so I hope that they continue to keep that going forward into this matchup, because if they don't, I think this DC Breeze team could really take them apart a bit.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't say this about a lot of DC New York matchups, especially over the last few seasons, but there is definitely, I think, a potential for this one to maybe get a little bit out of hand. I think New York certainly can keep it close, and I think maybe just the intensity and the focus that this type of rivalry brings will maybe allow New York to elevate their play despite missing, several key contributors. But if that doesn't happen, we're talking about a DC team that's, still one of the top, offensively efficient teams in the league, who's basically at full strength. Seems like a recipe for success for DC. They haven't beaten New York in how long now? I'm sure the days stretches into well into the thousands right now, right?
It
So
was
they
2018. You mentioned
yeah.
earlier New York having to overcome some obstacles. It was beating New York in the first round of the playoffs and that torrential downpour, zero scoring in the fourth quarter matchup
Yes.
in DC to begin the East Division playoff slate that year. And then New York went on and got their first ever franchise win against Toronto in the East Division championship game. That was the last time that this was any kind of real rivalry. I mean, it was the week before that DC had trumped the Empire at home in the final regular season weekend. So I don't know the exact number of days, but yeah, it's up there. It's a couple thousand.
Yeah, so I mean this might be the day where that all ends, right? Reset the counter to 0. It certainly looks favorable for DC, but I mean the last thing I think DC is going to do is take anything for granted. They're probably just as focused on this game despite all those absences, because they know this has been a giant that they just haven't been able to slay, and they don't want to squander the opportunity they have that's right in front of them. So I think it can still be really competitive. It will be interesting to see how the additions that New York picks up and kind of just like tosses into their roster, how those pan out. Um, I'm really excited for this one. I'm a little sad that I'm actually going to be playing at the same time that this game is going on. It'll be the first one probably on my queue to go back and watch on Sunday after playing Saturday.
I mean, you might have to watch it on the bus ride or something afterward. Well, you guys are hosting Minnesota, so that won't be the case. But maybe you go home and watch some late night film on Saturday, because it figures to be a pretty big battle. I want to transition now to the other big rivalry weekend matchup, and that is Colorado at Salt Lake, the last two West Division champions. The last time we saw them was just a couple weeks ago when Salt Lake beat the Summit by 5 goals in Colorado. The Summit won't have an easy weekend heading into Utah, as they have a Friday night battle in Oakland, environment that they lost a game in the middle of the regular season last year that kind of set them down the path that they're currently on, which is having a losing record over the last half dozen games that they've had.
And right now, Colorado has only played 3 games, but the only game they've won has been a home game against a Seattle team that was on their second day of a doubleheader. And this makes me incredibly nervous for them. Like, can they go into an Oakland team basically at full strength and win on the road? I don't know. Like, if you would have asked me a few weeks ago, I'd say yeah, like they're going to go in there and they're going to win that game. No problem. But they've looked so as great as they looked in their first game, they have looked equally as lost and just confused since then. And I don't think anything kind of sums up better what we've seen out of them for their last 2 games than what we saw on Friday night, where I want to say it was in the third quarter or maybe early in the fourth, where they force a turnover against Atlanta. They call a timeout, and then Nethercutt throws a stall one flick to nobody. And he just clearly wasn't quite on the same page. I think he was throwing to Noah Kuhlman. The disc was, 10 yards too deep. It was just like a completely unforced error. It was something that didn't need to be thrown. It was something that felt emotional and felt like somebody trying to be the guy winning the game instead of just being somebody who's there to help the team win. And that just kind of feels what I've been seeing out of Colorado. It's like a lot of really weird mistakes that they don't need to make because they're so talented. They could just kind of, run their system and score. I mean, despite their record, and despite the way they've looked in these last 2 games, I still think they just on a talent basis are as talented as anyone in the league, but they just can't seem to string it together. And I'm really worried about them going into this Oakland game, especially if we still don't see Quinn Finer. I think they're missing him like so badly, and they just need someone on offense to just be consistently open and consistently demanding the disc and making good decisions with it. And I feel like the lack of that they have right now is leading to these performances we've seen. So I don't know. I'm really nervous about this Oakland game for them. And then they have to go to Salt Lake the next day. This seems like, can you imagine at the beginning of the season if I said that they could potentially be 1-4 after 5 games? Because I think we're looking at a situation where that could really reasonably happen.
They could be 1-4. New York could be 4-3 after this weekend. Like, it's pandemonium out there, man. I want to push back on a couple of the criticisms that you've had about Colorado. One is that I actually think that despite lacking Finer and all UFA talent and one of the most efficient scorers this league has seen, they're doing okay. Like, they were admittedly really bad against Salt Lake. I don't want to excuse that performance, but their other 2 games, they've hovered right around 60% offensive success rate. Against Atlanta, they only committed 16 total turnovers as a team. Those are good numbers. The problem with their offense is that they don't make anything easy. They have just 24 combined red zone opportunities in their past 2 games, both losses. Remember how Pittsburgh had 22 in a game this past weekend? It's just one of those things where it feels like the Summit are setting themselves up for a bit of failure by relying a little too heavily on, I don't want to say a long ball because, again, they only took 9 huck attempts against the hustle, but it's something like that. They seem to settle in a way. It's like a NBA team who is afraid of attacking the paint and just sort of settles on pull-up jumpers. There's a little bit of that in this Colorado offense, and I think maybe where I'd take a little bit more to task is that then when they make those mistakes, they can be a little lethargic, picking up in transition and trying to stop opposing defenses from getting a break score. But to
So you're
me,
saying they're the Jason Tatum of the UFA, just settling for 3-pointers instead of attacking?
yeah, a little bit. Yeah. I mean, he's like a true 7-footer. He should be going into the paint virtually every offensive possession. And that's how I kind of feel a little bit about Colorado. You got all these playmakers who can get open in their one-on-one matchups. Why not make it a 5-yard cut as opposed to, a 50-yard drag route or something?
Yeah, I got a question for you. So when I look at this Colorado team, you're right. They're not committing, say, as many turnovers as Austin, who we mentioned earlier, is at like 19 a game. However, is it just me or does it seem like their turnovers are, even though that it's a lower number, it just seems like some of them are just so bad. Like it's just like kind of like I guess what you're mentioning about not attacking. It's just like why make that throw when there was an easier throw to be made? Like why are you relying on something fancy or something that's overly quick or something that's more of a 50-50 when you have as good of athletes, as good a team speed and quickness as anyone in the league?
Yeah, I think they're just making it hard on themselves. Getting back to what I was saying a moment ago, I don't mean to keep beating on that same drum, but that's just what I've seen from them. There's no simple explanation. I mean, we could go possession by possession and say good turnover versus bad. I hear you on some of that stuff, like the amount of easy transition scores that the hustle were able to capitalize on certainly was notable, but I think it's just a little bit of application, right? Like you've got to adopt. They're kind of the inverse of Boston in my mind. Like Boston does sort of the opposite. They get into each of their positions very readily. Everyone knows where to be on the field. Everyone knows to kind of move, get the ground game going, like you were saying, move that disc down the field and then get into opportune parts to score. And I'm just not seeing that from the Summit. But the other thing that's really been noticeable is that their defensive pressure has just kind of gone away a bit. I mean, they're getting some blocks, but their ability to generate and convert breaks has totally fallen off the table. They were just 2 of 8 against the hustle in their defensive break opportunities. I mean, where the Summit began last year, when they were 5-0 to start the 2023 season, they looked like a top 3 defense in this league. And, not to keep harping on it, and we've talked about it on this podcast pretty ad nauseum, but this points a bit to how important Cody Spicer was both in his coverage and in his transition quarterbacking duties to this Colorado defense. Like, I'm wondering if we're seeing a bit of the Spicer effect take hold of this Summit D line where they're losing 2 to 3 breaks a game that they could kind of just cash on before.
It definitely appears that way. But I think the same thing you mentioned about their offense and like making things hard on themselves, I think you can apply it to that D line too. Like, yeah, sometimes when they get the turnover, it just seems like you have so many athletes on that D line that can just probably win their matchups into easier to throw to spaces. And they're just kind of making it hard on themselves on that side of the disc too. And you're right, Cody Spicer, as great of a defender as he was so great on the counter attack and so calm with the disc in his hands. And it just ran through him. And you could just rely on him to be available and to make good decisions and to execute his throws. And it just seems like, to your point, they're lacking that this year. They don't quite have the counterattack punch that they did in years previous. We should also maybe give them a little bit of credit. They, 2 of their 3 games have been against 2 teams I think we consider to be top teams in this league. Even their first game was against a team who's currently sitting at 5-2. They haven't played, there have been no easy buckets so far for Colorado. It's not really going to get easier this weekend as they play, excuse me, 2 other teams who, you know, Salt Lake, who looks like the best team in the league, and an Oakland team who's definitely scrappy and still 100%, pushing for a playoff spot in the West. This could just be a really dangerous weekend for Colorado because if they lose this matchup with Oakland, that creates a huge problem for them, not just in their record, but they start to lose those head to heads with some of these teams because they have 3 more out of division games. They don't get a lot of in division opportunity throughout the rest of their season to like make up ground in head to heads, make up ground in division record. So every game that they lose really starts to pile up more quickly for them in their division than any other team.
Absolutely. I mean, it really comes down to that pesky little tiebreaker rule of your interdivisional record and stacking that up against your other interdivisional rivals that could really come back against the Summit team that, again, is sitting almost near the bottom of the West Division standings currently, which is just bizarre. But to your point, and I wanted to kind of flip over the script a bit as far as how we were criticizing this Colorado team. Yeah, they've basically just played top level teams. I mean, I'm finishing up my power rankings right now, and I have Seattle, Atlanta, and Salt Lake, their three opponents so far in 2024, all within the top 7. And given that the Summit have only played 3 games, given that their opponents have been that tough, given that we're still only at the beginning part of June, there could still be a lot of uphill momentum for this Colorado team to sort of gain. My problem is that I haven't always seen when the going gets tough for them to get going, right? Like, it's sort of felt like we keep coming back to this, you know, concept in amber of, but the talent of Colorado, but they're so talented. And it's like, okay, well, when is that going to purchase any wins? Never. Like, you could be one of the most talented teams in this league, still not make the playoffs. Go ask the 2022 Atlanta Hustle how that works out. You can go back and look at all their team statistics too. Really impressive season. They finished 8-4, didn't make the playoffs, didn't get a chance. And so I'm just curious as to what happens with Colorado if the losses continue to pile up. As like you say, if they experience turbulence in Oakland on Friday night against a full strength Spiders opponent that is still 3-2 and still battling and has a lot of dogs on that roster, and then has to go and face 6-0 Salt Lake on Saturday night. And to that point, I wanted to transition into talking a little bit about the Shred, both in terms of their home venue as well as just the style that they're playing with right now. I think that of any stadium, the Shred have the biggest home field advantage in the UFA. And I think that right now it's worth like 1 to 3 goals per game. And I think especially against an opponent in Colorado that the Shred fan base loves to tee off on, if the Summit lose on Friday night, that's like adding a hardness multiplier going into Zion's Bank on Saturday night. Like, you're just not going to hear the end of it. I've had Shred players come up to me telling me they've been making signs weeks in advance for this Colorado matchup. Like, nobody in Salt Lake is taking this game against the Summit lightly. And so the Summit are just going to have a real slog going into week 7. And who knows, maybe they win both games and they turn out 3-2 and we've got a complete upending of the West Division to join along with the East Central and what feels like the complete tumult of the UFA landscape. But right now, it just feels like the Summit aren't only going up against the one of 2 undefeated teams this season, they're going up against the hardest fan base to play against.
And of course, that's the second day too. So you're going to have all this travel, tired legs from the day before. Because even if they win in Oakland, I don't anticipate that game is going to be a rout. Like, it's going to be a battle until the end. Because we've talked about this with Oakland, right? Oakland messes up every game for everyone. There's going to be 40 turnovers in this game because that's just what Oakland does. They're going to turn the disc over 20 plus times. They're going to find a way to make sure Colorado does too. And it's going to be a slog. And then they're going to have to go into Zion Big Stadium against, with that incredible fan base, with the incredible team. And they're just going to be, and the Shred, it's going to be all gas, no brakes the whole time. And you're going to have to do that on the second day of a back-to-back. That sounds absolutely miserable.
Yeah. And again, just given the way that this Shred team is playing, there's no breathing room on either line. They in all 6 games this year, they've had 17 or fewer turnovers. They have absolutely jump-started their red zone efficiency after converting under 80% in their first 3 games. They're up over 90 combined in their last 3 games and have, as we've talked about before, risen back up into the top 5 in the league in that kind of efficiency. They don't take many deep looks, particularly at home, which I find interesting. They've really kind of settled down the Huck Happy fever that they had going on there, especially on D-line the first 2 years. They channel the energy differently, I feel like now. And there's just, again, you've got the prospective MVP and Jordan Kerr. You've got Grant Lindsley really filling into that role that I think they envisioned him in, bringing him onto the team last year, which is like this do all, top 7 in the league when he really turns it on player who just sort of slots in as a role player where they need him to on offense or defense. They use him as the most magical, versatile two-way player in the league right now. Like, oh, we've just got a Grant Lindsley laying around. Let's put him in offensive handler role. Well, this next week we're putting him in defensive counterattacking handler role. Like, we'll figure it out as we go along. Complete embarrassment of riches right now for Bryce Merrill and this coaching staff, having that to work with in addition to this rest of the rest of this roster. We've talked about before in the show, Jake Miller continues to play basically mistake-free ultimate and just provides an absolute bedrock foundation for everything that offense does. What do you even keep talking about with Salt Lake at this point without using more superlatives? I'm almost looking a little bit for a weakness. They've kind of put the ruby vision glasses over my eyes as far as what does it mean to be undefeated in this league? I start thinking of them like last year's Empire team, where it's just like, this is a front to back winning lineup.
Yeah, they're a team too where, every team runs, generally speaking, like 2 different defensive lines. And you might run more than that, but essentially, you've got your 20-man roster, you've got your seven guys that are mostly playing O-line, and then your 7 kind of D1 guys, like your top defensive line, your second defensive line. And this is a team where this doesn't happen very often. You can count on like maybe 1 or 2 teams per year where it just feels like it doesn't matter what combination of guys they put out there on defense. I feel like they're going to get a break. And like that's about the highest compliment I can pay like an entire, roster of 20 is like, yeah, I don't care who you have out there on offense. I don't care which combination of 7 guys you got out there on defense. I feel like you're going to be successful. And you just don't see that a lot where you just favor one team's 7 guys on the line, no matter who they put out there. And to your point, having guys like Grant Lindsley that you can just kind of plug in wherever you want, or being able to make mid-game adjustments like they did a couple weeks ago, where they just like completely swap guys out of their O-line and D-line and just interchange them, and things just keep running.
Yeah, they ripped an O-line starter,
that's
Ben
wild.
Field, off the
Yeah.
starting rotation, and then just plugged in a teenage rookie in Grayson Retberg and finish out the game just fine against the San Diego team that was hard charging against him. I mean, that's just not something other teams are doing right now.
They might not necessarily do that two-way playing the way that Grant would, because like, let's just be real. There just aren't a lot of people. There aren't a lot of players that exist that can do things in as many different roles as well as Grant Lindsley can. Like that's something that comes with being a superior athlete, as well as just lots of time playing Frisbee, which, a lot of these shred players are pretty young. They haven't put in the time to have thousands of points played in all these different positions. But what they do have is speed and athleticism across the board. And they have a team culture that allows them to make adjustments and to have their roles change without anyone batting an eye, without anyone getting their feelings all hurt. Like, they buy into it. They support each other. You don't find that everywhere.
You know what the really nice thing about this Colorado at Salt Lake game on Saturday night is that it time slots in perfectly so that you can watch the New York at DC, or as we'll talk about in a second, the Minnesota Indy game, and then just go right on over to Colorado and the Shred. Really like that kind of scheduling alignment in the UFA. Would love to see more of that. Would love to honestly see like how the NFL does, where there's like the one set of windowed games and then the next set of windowed games. That'd be a nice little alignment of all of our scheduling. But we've only got so much more time on this episode, and I wanted to give, obviously, your chance to talk about this upcoming Central Division tilt between Minnesota and the Alley Cats. Minnesota currently sitting at 3-1 atop the Central Division, and all the chaos ensuing beneath them in the standings. And then you guys are obviously coming off of a tough 8-goal loss at Pittsburgh. You're at 2-2. Minnesota looks like they're going to have one of their more optimal lineups of the season. They will get their 2024 debut from thrower Will Brandt. And indoors, Minnesota has given you guys a lot of fits over the past couple of years. They've been close results, but wind chill have, I think, historically had the most problems on offense as far as their consistency. And obviously, when you have no elements affecting you, you can really build a rhythm quite quickly. What has been your experience playing the wind chill at home in Grand Park, and how are you guys kind of bouncing back after that lackluster effort on Sunday?
Yeah, I mean, we're excited that we get to host this game. You know, it's our only matchup of the season, and anytime you only have to play a team once, if you of course prefer that to be a home game. So we definitely got the lucky end of the schedule there. That being said, we have to take care of business. I mean, Minnesota is going to be bringing in the best roster that they've had in a game yet this season, adding Paul Kernick, adding Will Brandt. Um, the big question mark for us, of course, is what does this offense look like with Will Brandt in it? Because he has not been there. We don't have any film to go look at to be like, all right, how has the offense changed? You know, minus Abe Coffin plus Will Brandt, and having Matt Rader out there. We haven't seen that combination, so we don't really know 100% what to expect. But you're right; they've given us the business offensively indoors. They've been very good, even going back to 2019 when we had a game that went down to the wire against them indoors, and they played their best offensive game of the season. And Josh Klain in particular really seems to love Grand Park. I mean, you look at the games he's put up in Grand Park. He's maybe been as comfortable there as any person who comes in and visits. Um, so we know we got our work cut out for us. We're obviously coming off a disappointing result. They're coming off of a bye week and a week before getting that big win in Madison on Friday night, the week of college nationals. So we're kind of two teams coming off very different results in this one, but just really excited because we just haven't quite been able to get over the Minnesota hump these last few years. We've played them tight in some games, but we just haven't quite been able to get over the top. And so I always look forward to these matchups where maybe we can finally get to the point where we're beating Minnesota again, because we haven't beaten them since 2019.
The other player I'll list alongside Klain that really lights it up whenever they play at Indianapolis, Quinn Snyder, who was finding
Quinn
more
Snyder, yep.
time on offense in that game at Madison after starting the first couple of games on defense almost exclusively for the Wind Chill in 2024. He figures he might reprise his receiving role indoors because he's been on the receiving end of a lot of those Klain bombs whenever they go to Grand Park.
Yeah, Quinn's a great athlete. He's a great cutter. I mean, he's a Team Canada player for a reason.
Yeah, and
Yeah, you're right.
to that point, I'm a little worried about Minnesota getting all of their size basically for this matchup, in addition to Snyder being active. You've got Matt Rader. They're also going to be activating and making a 2024 debut for the Minnesota product, Anthony Jarrell, who is really impressive defensively for Grey Duck at Nationals. He's a big body who can really make plays in space. Tanner Barkis, Colin Berry. I feel like, especially with you guys not having Jake Fella this season, there's a pretty noticeable lack of size at times for you guys. You're such a skilled unit, and there's so much chemistry and experience on your various lineups. But do you guys have any kind of contingency for how to deal with Minnesota might just being able to line you up and run down on you?
It's a great question. Not only did we lose Jake Fella, who is like 6'3", 6'3" maybe 6'4". We lost Fletcher Hare, another guy around 6'4". We lost Will Quigley, who's 6'7". I mean, we lost three very large men this year, and yeah, you can't really replace height. And you're right, we we replaced height with maybe some more speed, some more youth in some areas. And we're just gonna have to go out there and kind of figure it out. We've had success, against Minnesota at home and like keeping in games. I think offensively, we're just gonna have to be really sharp. We played one of the best offensive games we've played in our team's history this past weekend against Chicago, and Chicago's defense has been pretty stout this year. So um, I think we worked in some things in practice this week, and we're hoping that we can implement those this week in a way that helps us, leads to some success. But I definitely think there's going to be some pressure on our offense to perform at a similar level that we did last week against Chicago. So, offensively, if we can do that, then we know that our defense is going to be able to generate, enough to support us. As our coach calls it, our defense will give us some run support, and we'll be able to come out on top. But, these Minnesota matchups, they're tough. Defensively, they've been one of the best teams in the league for a long time. Offensively, adding Matt Rader this year just adds a level of firepower that is a little scary. So I have a feeling like a lot of our games against Minnesota at home, it's going to be one of those where it's going to come down to the last 6 minutes of the game is where everything's going to be decided, because I don't anticipate either team really pulling away in this one.
I kind of hope you both do that for your fans and don't do that to your fans. I mean, the Cardiac Cats have been something to behold at Grand Park. I mean, this last weekend, you guys had buzzer beaters in all 4 quarters. The last 5 minutes of regulation of that game against Chicago felt like there was a score every 20 seconds. It was just score, response. And it's been like that in games past against Minnesota. I know you say that the wind chill have had the edge the past several seasons, but it's not like a lot of those games have been blowouts in Minnesota's favor. You guys have always clung tough and battled tight, and I expect that once again on Saturday night. But that will do it for this episode of Swing Pass. You can tune in for all 12 games of the Week 7 slate live on watchufa.tv. Again, on Friday night, you can tune in for Colorado at Oakland, which begins their big road trip as they get set up for their Saturday night battle in Salt Lake. You can also find on Friday night Austin at Atlanta, a rematch of the 2023 South Division title game. You have to imagine Atlanta is licking its chops big time for that. And then the Soul will have to go on the road the next night to face 4-0 Carolina. Then, of course, the game of the week on Saturday night, New York at DC, 7 p.m. Eastern on watchufa.tv. There's a whole bunch of other action to tune into, like we just previewed the Minnesota at Indy game. But we only have so many words and so much time. That'll do it for this episode. We'll talk to you soon. Bye now.